Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today in another edition of Itaú ao Cubo. This time, we're going to focus on payments. Today, here with me, we have Marco Calvi. He's the head of financial services within our research team. How are you, Marcos?
I'm great, Julia. Thank you for hosting this event.
Thank you. And we also have Eduardo Brunetti, VP on the technology coverage within our investment banking. How are you, Eduardo?
Good morning, Julia. Good morning, Bruno, Marco.
So today we have a very complete agenda. We are going to start off with Bruno Balduccini. He is a partner of Pinheiro Neto Advogados, one of the most known for law firms here in Brazil. And he is an expert on the regulatory perspective of open banking and payments. Right after, we're going to have the pitch of three startups, SpinPay, BitCapital, and Hash. And we are going to end the day with Carlos Neto, CEO of Matera. Just to note that this first presentation and the final presentation will be done in English, while the three pitches in the middle will be done in Portuguese. If you have any questions, feel free to send over to your sales representative or comment here on LinkedIn. We are live in LinkedIn of Itaú BBA. So without further ado, Bruno, thank you very much for being here. Let's start with your presentation. We are eager to learn everything that you have to share.
Very good. First of all, thank you very much for you guys for the invitation. It's going to be a pleasure here to share with you the content. This part is going to be very intense in the sense of amount of information, but what I try to do and what we will try to do in the next 40 minutes is to go over the recent changes in the regulations and how they are impacting the new business, the old businesses, and where we're going to land in the future. So let me just share my screen with you guys. 1 second. Here we go. I believe you can see it, right? Just to be sure.
Yes.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, guys. So let's start. I think the first point here is just a quick overview of the firm. I don't want to spend too much money. It was founded in 1942, so it's almost getting closer to 80 years old. We have around 450 attorneys. We have around 103 partners. We have offices in Rio, Brasilia, São Paulo, and more recently Palo Alto and Tokyo. We also didn't put here, but we have around 200 and odd trainees as well, which is part of the firm. And it's a very traditional law firm, but still at the same time, I think we're managing to keep up with technology and being up ahead. These are the areas that we have in the firm. There is a new, let's say, ball, I didn't put it on, which is our acceleration program. So this program was created by myself in the past 7-8 years ago. And what we have done is we have basically created a system whereby we help small, young, and sometimes not so young entrepreneurs with ideas. And what happens is that we ended up entering into a 3 to 5 year agreement whereby we do not charge any fees for this fintech guy, whereby we help them to set the company, grow, go for Series A, B, C, and basically we get paid if he raises funds. We agree on a percentage of how much of the money he raises to pay our fees back, but this way we managed to create a program which today has about 38 companies. We had in the past 9 cases of success. Coincidentally, SpinPay, that's going to speak after myself, is actually one of the accelerated companies. So that's why you're going to meet Alan and others, and you understand why we like him so much. So now jumping into exactly what happened in the last years, is important to show this time bar. Until 2013, basically the central bank was very focused on financial institutions, and therefore they follow a specific set of rules. Central bank is a very serious regulator, and the focus was always looking into large size banks that could withstand the different economic plans, inflation, and therefore typical Brazil, we always were very open for competition. So there was a time that a lot of foreign banks entered Brazil, but again, as there is a joke here, Brazil is not for beginners, and some of them ended up leaving Brazil, and the banking market in a way was somehow concentrated. In 2010, the central bank decided to dig in the payments arena. And the reason is that because the banks concentrated, five banks concentrated 80–90% of the market, naturally, they also concentrated the payments as well. And so the central bank decided to make a study. And this 2010 study basically reaches two conclusions. One is that the credit card market was too concentrated. Basically, MasterCard and Visa, due to historical reasons and scale reasons, basically enter agreements with the larger banks, and the market was somehow closed for new issuers and new acquirers. And understandably, why would you increase your risk when you don't need to increase risk? So the market was like this. And on the other side, the central bank realized that there was a substantial amount of people that were keep their money in non-bank financial institutions. And at the time, it's really funny to say, look at the report, central bank, he mentions that there's this company called PayPal, and actually they hold money, but they're not a regulated entity. So the central bank also thought we need somehow to protect this, the Brazilian that doesn't have a bank account or does not want to have a bank account, but is keeping the money with this non-regulated entity. So in 2013, Congress gave the central bank the power to regulate, and that's where this law 12865 appeared, and basically give the necessary power for the central bank to regulate payments. And payments includes prepaid or postpaid instrument. Any kind of credit card or postpaid instrument, any kind of e-wallet structure is regulated. And so if you look at these boxes here, there are several instances whereby the regulations are being implemented and created. But if you look from a regulatory perspective, it's pretty fast, because if you look at 2013 and now 2020, 21, the amount of changes were quite impressive. So of note is this law. Then there are a lot of circulars and letter circulars. Then one of note as well, the SEC in Brazil decided to also regulate crowdfunding. It's kind of limited, but it was a first move of the SEC, the Brazilian CVM, to move on to that. And then we start seeing new changes on P2P lending and B2P lending. Again, lending in Brazil was only for larger financial institutions, but the central bank, knowing and looking into fintech models, decided to take a try and test new models which were lighter from a regulatory point of view, but would also be able to lend. And then we start having discussions 2018 and 2019 about instant payments, nowadays called PIX, as well as the open banking initiative. And finally, more recently, we have the joint resolution, as well as the public consultation 76, which already is implemented in some parts about the instant pay. So it's a lot of changes over the period of time, a lot of work for lawyers, and a very interesting market. So here, I think it's important to quickly understand on the payments, the logic of the central bank on the payment side. Especially on the credit card and postpaid instrument, the logic of the central bank was we do need to open up the market, and therefore the set of rules that were created were basically to break up the duopoly, let's call it like that, that existed between two largest networks and the larger banks. And therefore they created a set of rules whereby the networks were obliged to open up under the penalty of being punished by the central bank. So they became regulated. They had to open up their systems, where also the central bank changes rule on the participants of a payment network, like an issuer and acquirer, which I'll explain in a minute. But basically, they started to look at the market as a whole. They started to understand the risks that the market created, that existed at the time with the opening up. And in fact, if you look nowadays, the amount of new players and the new arrangements that were created is quite impressive to see. I think that the central bank was in fact very right to do what they have done. And I think they have achieved a higher level of competition through regulation. So here, just to give a general overview, the concept is quite interesting. So if you want to create a payment arrangement, a payment arrangement means a network like a credit card or an e-wallet structure. The logic of the central bank is that you do not need any kind of approval from the central bank. Basically, the logic is you start operating, and until you hit specific threshold volumes, you don't need to get any approval. Once you hit this threshold volumes, then obviously you continue to operate, but then you apply for a specific license. In this specific case is a payment arrangement license. So if I create a new network, a credit card network, I can start with no approval. And once I hit the thresholds, then I apply. And the thresholds are these ones here. So if the payment arrangement, the whole amount, has a higher volume of 500 million reais of total financial volume in the last 12 months, or if there are more than 25 million transactions within this payment arrangement, then this is one of the triggers that requires the payment arrangement itself, the network itself, to apply for a license. So this applies for any kind of payment instrument, including an e-wallet structure. So that's the logic of the regulation, which proved to be pretty smart in the sense that if you are starting and you're bringing new technologies, it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to create regulatory costs. Once you hit a specific volume and we think that is systemically relevant, then obviously you have to go and get the approval. Regarding the network itself, basically they impose on the Visa, MasterCard, Amex, and others, basically to have a presence in Brazil, they would have to get central bank approval. They had to present a lot of minimal technical operational capabilities. They also had to improve their internal controls, but most importantly, they had to change their internal rules, the MasterCard rules, the Visa rules, so that they would create a very objective, non-subjective rule. And this meant that these rules had to be substantially amended at the request of the central bank, whereby everything that could allow the network to decide unilaterally if you would allow a player to come in or not, a player meaning an issuer or an acquirer, the central bank would say, no, you need to put objective criteria, and I'm not going to interfere what are these criteria, but let's say minimum capital, rating, and things like that. Once a candidate meets these objective criteria, you as a network have to accept this player. So this is the logic behind whereby the central bank is forcing competition. So this is for the payment arrangements. Now, the players that play inside the payment arrangement, and so if you look down here, which are the payment institutions, what we call the players that play inside the payment arrangement, are the issue of credit card or any kind of post-paid instrument. So people tend to think about like, oh, only credit cards are regulated. No, if you look at tag companies that use on the highways, on the parkings, these are as well post-paid instruments. So for example, you look at Sem Parar, which is one company that provides your tag in your car where you go through the highway and you pass through without paying, having to stop to pay to pass through the highways. Basically, this is a company that has a post-paid instrument. So the central bank really is focusing on the concept, not on the payment instrument itself. So one of the entities regulated is the issue of credit card or post-paid. The other one are prepaid or e-wallets, which again are free to be created, and once again they can operate in Brazil. And finally, the acquiring, usually typically linked to post-paid instruments, but it could be also linked to prepaid or e-wallet instruments. And similarly to the payment arrangements, a payment institution as well is free to start operating without any kind of approval from the central bank. So if I want to start issuing a credit card and I want to be part of Visa, MasterCard, or any of these companies, what first I need to do is I do not need any approval from the central bank. I just need to enter into a commercial agreement with Visa and MasterCard. But then I'll have to look at Visa, MasterCard rules, which have to be objective. And if I meet those thresholds, that obligations, that objective obligations that Visa, MasterCard, Amex, and others have set down, they have to approve me. And so that explains how you see a lot of newcomers and new players like Nubank and Neon and others appearing into the market and creating competition. On the acquiring side, same thing. You start seeing Stone, you start seeing GetNet and others that appear after the regulations were issued. And again, same logic here. If you want to become an issuer of a postpaid, a prepaid, or an acquiring, then you can start operating with central bank approval. And once you hit this specific thresholds, and note that they're a little bit different than the payment arrangement. So here, the first one, amount in payment transactions, 500 million. So if you have to look at your own operation, if I am Nubank, do I have more than 500 million reais of volume transacted in the last 12 months? And the answer is yes. then I have triggered one of the thresholds. Or if I am an issuer of a prepaid, and this is different from the payment arrangement itself, so I issue e-wallets, and if I have more than 50 million reais in deposit in the last 30 days, considering 12 months, looking behind 12 months, then again, I have triggered this threshold, and therefore I need to apply for a license. And so that's what happens to a lot of the players. They start without a license. They just made an agreement with the payment network, and that's it. They start operating. And then once they hit the threshold, they continue to operate, they apply for a license, and they become a payment institution. And again, as a payment institution, very similar to a financial institution, they do have to follow specific rules, such as specific accounting requirements. Any change of control, you need central bank approval. There is an unlimited liability of the controlling shareholders in the event they go into bankruptcy or suffer intervention. So basically, it is a kind of a like of financial institution without a base of regulations, however, minimum capital, minimum network. So this is basically what the central bank has done. And in fact, if you look at the scenario, competition scenario, it has certainly changed a lot, and there's a lot of players. And as a consequence, there is a lot of issues on margins. Now, in the past, you could see the numbers of the incumbents, the numbers and the profitability were pretty high. Nowadays, because of competition, we are going towards a more Americanized market whereby you earn on volume, not on individual transactions. So in other words, your margins have dropped a lot. So the hot topics on the payments I have summarized here is basically it's a very low barrier for entry, which means that a lot of clients of the firm and like retailers, small companies that actually had always to partner up with banks to have their credit card issued or to offer a e-wallet structure to their clients or a bank account structure, they do not need to use the banks anymore. Basically, they can do themselves because, as I mentioned, you can start operating without any license, and once you hit specific thresholds, then fine, then you can simply go for it and apply for a license, but operate yourself. So this actually is causing some tension in the market because a big retailer that decides to offer an e-wallet and decides to offer a credit card can do it by itself. And on the financing side, and I'll talk for a minute, they have also created the possibility of use a fintech bank that yourself can create. So basically, as you can see, the logic of these rules are competition, and therefore people are looking into that. Some of them look at the margin of the banks and they say, you know what, I can do it better, I can do it cheaper, and I can still keep the margins to myself. So that's one important thing. The second is once the central bank understood the credit card market, it imposed a centralized liquidation system called CIPI, whereby all payments, all transactions are now centralized in a system, and thereby the systemic risk is now more controlled. And therefore, some transactions in the past whereby you could keep the float or you could manage the float and funding is now being eliminated because of the centralized system. There is a discussion in Brazil if the credit card market, whereby it's very typical Brazilian, it settles in 30 days of a purchase, should go to 2 days. In other words, if I make a purchase with my credit card in a merchant, I myself have to pay my credit card company, the issuer, in usually 22 days as an average. However, the issuer is only going to pay the acquirer of that transaction in 27 days average, and the acquirer is going to only pay the merchant or the sub-acquirer and then the merchant in D+30. So the system in the past was created to have always a positive flow of money. So the central bank says, should we decide to reduce this to D+2 and follow international standards? And when the central bank started to come up with this idea, obviously the answer from the smaller companies said, well, but then if you want me as an issuer to reduce from D30 to D2, it means that I'll need to get funding in the banks so that I can comply with this mismatch of funds. When I go and ask for funding, I need to go to the larger banks, which in turn issue their own credit cards or do the acquiring themselves. Therefore, there'll be some competition. So the fees and the cost of my funding is going to be off, and therefore the logic of the central bank to cause competition goes away. So then the central bank says, yep, you're right, it's kind of complicated to change this. So for the time being, we're not going to change until we create more competition in the market. Another thing that the central bank got very concerned is that in Brazil, if you purchase something with your credit card, it's very standard that you pay and you decide to pay that purchase in installments. In other words, the merchant itself offers installment payments. So you go and buy an aspirin, and it's very common that the cashier says, would you like to do it in 3 installments? Or if you buy a TV on your credit card, the merchant offers 10 installments, which means that for every installment, a transaction will be processed in the whole system. In other words, I'll pay my first installment to the issuing bank or the issuer will pay that first installment to the acquirer, and the acquirer will pay the installment to the merchant, and this will repeat 10 times. Problem is, the majority of the transactions in Brazil are in fact installment payment. Brazilians tend to not look at the price and the cost of a purchase, the cost of the funding of a purchase, but they look if they can pay a specific installment in their budget. So this is a very strong cultural issue. So 70%, 60 to 70% of purchases in Brazil are installment. And as a consequence, when the central bank understood the market, the first question it asked the networks was, okay, so you have a 10 installment transaction, cardholder pays the first installment to issuer pays that installment to acquirer pays to the merchant. Comes the second month, card member pays their second installment, but issuer fails. Will the network guarantee that transaction? In other words, will they step in and cover the next 9 installments? And the answer was no, we don't do that. And why? Because we don't have this in the States. We don't have the necessary budget for that, and so we don't do it. And so that caused a huge stress to the central bank, because they did understand that there was a substantial systemic risk behind this. And therefore, they started to get very concerned. Also, the networks are not obliged by law to provide a guarantee. And honestly, probably if you look at Visa and MasterCard, because Brazil tends to be the second or third largest market, the amount of guarantees they had to put probably would be not possible to cover Brazil and the rest of the world. So central bank was very concerned. Then COVID-19 comes, and so the central bank decides to move and issues a provisional measure whereby, which has been now approved in Congress, so it became law, whereby it created a bankruptcy remote status of all the future flow of a credit card company. So in my example, when I have to pay my second installment of that 10 installment purchase and the issuer goes into bankruptcy, this law allows this money not to be stuck in the issuer as issuer's asset. It becomes a pass-through. So the money that I pay to the issuer and the issuer fails, this money will flow to the acquirer. If the acquirer fails as well, goes into bankruptcy, the money will flow to the merchant itself. So they have created a bankruptcy remote flow, which is quite an interesting for securitization companies. So if you are a fund and you're buying receivables that you have against an acquirer, a sub-acquirer, or a issuer, basically this will give you the benefit of having a bankruptcy remote status. In other words, you do buy that receivable, you pay to an issuer, to acquire, to the sub-acquirer, and then in the future, this money will flow to you. So the credit risk of the transaction is not the company's issuer, acquirer, sub-acquirer failing, but the fact that the card holders don't pay the issuer, because that's where the money comes from. So it's quite an interesting move, but certainly understandable considering the size of the risk. And because the central bank created this rule, because the central bank created a centralized payment system for credit card, it also created a centralized system whereby you can post the receivables that are given in guarantee or are being sold to third parties. So the central bank created a set of rules that come into force in November, or may be delayed, but in fact allows any participant, including banks, credit funds, securitization companies, to go to merchants and say, look, you have a future flow of receivables. I'm buying this future flow and I'm registering this transaction into this centralized registration system. When they do that, basically that receivable cannot be sold or given in guarantee for any other transaction. So it gives a lot of certainty to the system. In addition, because it's bankruptcy remote based on the provisional measure, it is a perfect storm in the sense that you have a very good asset with a very low risk, which works in a way as financing to the merchants. The logic of the central bank, again, is to decrease the price of funding of merchants, which is the last point in the chain. Obviously, this is quite an interesting change. Now, we also have to look into two other changes, which is the open banking and the PIX. In the open banking, as you're going to see, there will be a lot of free competition for revolving lines and acquiring lines to merchants as well. And so, as I will explain later, there is an additional layer of competition that will be caused by open banking. Finally, the PIX. PIX is a system we'll explain very shortly, but question is, will PIX basically adopt or affect the debit industry in the sense that central bank is creating a much cheaper competitive product in a way which will replace debit, and how impact this will be in the networks and the issuers of debit cards is something that we can discuss later on here on the PIX discussion. And finally, we all see the WhatsApp case. WhatsApp is not a payment arrangement. I help WhatsApp and I help MasterCard, so I will only discuss public information, but WhatsApp is not a payment arrangement. It's just a technology of communicating parties. And WhatsApp basically is using, or decided to use, to start in Brazil, the railings, the debit railings and the credit railings of Visa and MasterCards. In other words, if I want to send money from A to B, and I want to send money to Brunetti, for example, and I have money in my own debit card, basically through WhatsApp, I simply order a transfer of money from my debit card to Brunetti's account. That's what it is. Simple as that. Is not a payment arrangement. And also, you can purchase with your WhatsApp. Basically, again, you can go online, and when you're going to buy something from a client, you basically can use the internet, or you can use a WhatsApp message, provided that the merchant has a WhatsApp for business. And again, here you're using the credit card railings or the debit railings. So we did not create any payment arrangement. Central bank, however, got very scared in the sense that the size of WhatsApp. So allegedly, WhatsApp has 120 million accounts, which represents all the banks together having bank accounts. So they were a little bit concerned that this could create some impact on PIX, and also it wasn't very clear to them, if there was any kind of exclusivity arrangement. So this WhatsApp entry was suspended after the central bank changed the regulations in order to have the necessary statutory power to stop it. Now the networks have provided information to the central bank. The antitrust authorities started with an injunction prohibiting the transaction to go ahead. The injunction was already dropped. So now the discussion lies at the central bank to see if they understand this is just part of an existing payment arrangement and if it's equal treatment to any other players in the market. Again, very interesting moments where you see the central bank becoming, in a way, a competitor dash regulator, because they're looking to PIX. They want PIX to be successful. And maybe there was a little bit here of conflict of roles between regulator and competitors. It's something that we will learn over the next days to see if this is in fact, or the central bank understands the system as non-competing for PIX. Times to see in the future. Another very, very important changes are the credit fintechs. So basically the central bank looking at the existing models that had in Brazil, and here it's important to mention that lending in Brazil is privy of banks. Only banks and financeiras, which is another kind of an institution, can lend money. And in order to become a bank or a financeira, you need a substantial amount of capital. You have Basel rules, you have a lot of rules, which is very expensive. So the central bank, looking into alternative models, started to see situations whereby fintech companies using their technology and using the cell phone could, partnering up with a financial institution, could offer credit in Brazil. We helped an American client to test the model back in 2013, 14. And the interesting thing is that Brazilians tend to be very prone to technology. They like to test new things. And so the previous tests that we did with them, which always involved a financial institution lending money, but the fact that people would use the cell phone to get a loan, basically allowed this company to provide lending all over Brazil with the same reach of both Bradesco and Itaú, but without having one physical branch, which shows that the technology, in fact, can make a difference. And obviously the cost of acquisition of a client was substantially lower compared to any physical branches of banks, because obviously you didn't have that. So the central bank looked at these models, thought it very interesting, and basically created two kinds of financial institution. One is the B2P model, which is called the SCD, which stands for Direct Credit Company in Portuguese, but basically allows a super light financial institution with 1 million reais capital to basically use that capital to lend money without usury law or without limitations, because it is a financial institution. However, because it cannot take deposits, it cannot leverage itself, it can only use its own capital to lend, basically it has to either put more capital to continue lending or it has to sell it. So what happened is that this rule allows this super light bank to lend money and at the same time sell it to a credit fund, a securitization company, or to an investor, a qualified investor. And so when they sell these receivables, these loans, this money goes back to the SCD, which in turn continues to lend. So basically what the central bank has done is created a very, very light financial institution with a very fast approval process. We're talking about 6 months to have approved. And these companies, through the capital markets, are financing themselves and are providing competition in credit in Brazil. And so the central bank is really betting into the system. In addition, these SCDs can also issue credit cards. They can also issue the e-wallets that I mentioned before. So although they're not a bank, although they cannot use the money that they obtain in the wallet to fund themselves, they act almost like a bank, but in a very light structure, very technological, which is creating a lot of disruption in the market. In the firm, we saw the list now approved. We have something like 15 of these SCDs already approved. We have another 30 in the pipeline. And interestingly is that we don't only see specifically only fintech companies. We start seeing retailers. So as I mentioned before, the retailer can issue a credit card, the retailer can offer an e-wallet, and now the retailer can also lend. So they start thinking, well, you know, actually I can do that myself. Why don't I know my client, I have the client base, I don't need the banks anymore, so I will enter the market. And I will basically keep the returns and the profits on the lending in Brazil, which is pretty good, provided that you know how to lend money, which is something not easy. So this is the SCD model. The SEP model is a P2P model. And in this situation, again, the SEP is a financial institution, but it doesn't use its own money to lend money. It basically allows the intermediation between people, lenders, people that want to lend money with people that want to receive loans, and basically only performs the management of the two sides of the story, and has specific rules they have to follow. But again, it is an alternative model for lending. It is not as popular as the SCD. I would say 95% of the fintech banks are SCD, 5% are only SEP. Again, because the SCP model is not as scalable as the SCD model. However, it's an alternative way of lending that the central bank is really betting very high. Now, finally, let's go to the two next points, which is the instant payment, the PIX. So if you are familiar with Brazil, Brazil has already a quite advanced instant payment for normal business hours, whereby you process DOC TED, which is the wire transfer system, which is quite good, but it's not 24/7, and it was created back in the beginning of the year 2000, which was quite unique. Now the time has passed, and the central bank, after learning through the regulation and regulating this industry, these different methods of payment, decided to create another system, which is in theory cheaper, faster, and fair compared to existing payment systems. And it's important to mention that the PIX system is going to be able to use for any situation. So P2P, P2B, business to business, person to government, government to business. So you can pay taxes in the future, you can pay fees. Basically, it's for any kind of payment, but with the feature of being 24/7 and real time. So what's behind PIX? Well, PIX, basically the central bank looked at international experience and looked into the methods in Brazil, and basically looked into 4 methods and basically thought about the following. Cash. It is very expensive to print paper. Second, in Brazil, it attracts a lot of violence. So you need to basically carry the cash in armored cars. These will attract burglaries, shootings, and people dying. it has a very cost of management. And it also easy to money launder as well. There's no trackability. Checks, although if you look at the big cities, is something declining. It still exists in other regions of Brazil, but again, it has a very high cost of processing, very inefficient in some aspects, takes a longer time for processing and settling, and therefore they decided that is another system that's not efficient. The boleto, which is a very Brazilian thing, which is a barcode payment system, payment slip created by the banks. Central bank understands that the boleto is decentralized, has a lot of different pricing, and there's a little of abuse by some banks. Also, it's easy to money launder in the sense that you can pay a boleto using cash in a bank, and therefore there's a risk of money laundering. And finally, the debit cards. Although debit cards are very used in Brazil, central bank understands that debit card, because of its characteristic of having a network, of having an issuer and having an acquirer, basically it is an expensive method of payment. And therefore, they should think about something cheaper. And that's where central bank decides to create the PIX. Now, differently than jurisdiction like China, whereby the government let the whole system flow freely, in Brazil, the PIX, actually the settlement, the core of the system is owned by the central bank. And so here I have put a quick drawing that explains. So basically the central bank is the owner of a real-time payment system called SPI. Now, banks that have bank accounts or e-wallet, payment institutions that have e-wallets, so banks with bank account or e-wallet, or payment institutions like Nubank, Neon that have e-wallets will have to, in some situations, or will have the option to connect themselves, having a kind of a reserve account into the system. And what happens is that, let's think about some name, right? Nubank, just to make it clear, Nubank has a payment institution approved by the central bank because it hit the thresholds. Nubank offers what we call the transaction account. They offer e-wallet, they call Nu Conta, right? And on the other hand, let's think about a restaurant that has a bank at Itaú, a bank account at Itaú. So Itaú would basically also be part of the PIX system. Each of the players will have to have a reserve account with cash available at all times. And basically when someone goes and, let's say I go with my Nu Conta and buy a pizza on a Sunday night, at the time of payment, there will be several methods of payment, but including PIX. And what happens is that I will read the barcode, the QR code at the counter at the pizzeria. And at this time, what happens is that the system checks if one, Bruno has balance into its account with Nubank, and if Nubank has money into this account, they confirm the transaction. If the answer is yes, reserve flow from Nubank reserve account into Itaú's reserve account, plus messaging, whereby the pizzeria owner receives an SMS or a message saying, you just received in your bank account of Itaú 100 reais for the pizza you just sold. And this will happen in 2 to 6 seconds. And in addition, according to the central bank, the cost of using this system here is going to be 1 cent per batch of 10 transactions. So in theory, this system here is going to be cheaper from a debit card or safer from a check because the money settles real time. Debit card in Brazil settle in D+2. Checks obviously has the issue about that. It's not very common to have a boleto in this situation, and cash, it is possible to accept, but it's because of violence in Brazil, it's something that the merchants usually don't like. In addition to that, it's important to mention that in Brazil, it is possible to price differentiate, although people don't use it, but it is possible for a merchant to say, you can pay with your debit card and will cost you 105, but if you pay with PIX, it's 100. So they can do that. And so there is a chance that merchants will be the most important vector to push PIX in Brazil because they're going to look for the cheapest price possible. But remember that PIX is not only for commercial transactions like this, it's to P2P, B2B, and other situations. So the central bank is betting very high. Final comment here is that if you are not a regulated entity and you offer, for example, e-wallets, or if you are a bank that has a bank account, but you don't meet the thresholds to be compulsory participation, you can indirectly participate into the system as well. So they're trying to connect as many people as possible. Now, important to mention that if I set my own e-wallet company here, right, and I don't have the necessary volume thresholds to become a payment institution approved by the central bank, as I mentioned before, but I can participate in the system. It's interesting that once I create my e-wallet, I do not need anymore to go and acquire merchants. I don't need to go and acquire people that will accept my e-wallet, because the central bank is providing this system. The central bank is providing free distribution to any new method of payment being created that is linked to the system here. And that also means that WhatsApp can connect to Itaú, can connect to Nubank, and use their bank account or their e-wallet to enter the transaction. And in fact, they are speaking with the central bank to see if they can also offer WhatsApp Pay into this PIX system. Finally, the last comments here is open banking. Now, open banking is something that exists in other countries. There's not a lot of different here. However, the open banking in Brazil is much more deep and ample, as you'll see in a second. Basically, the goals of open banking is to foster innovation, competition, more efficiency, and promote financial inclusion. There are some principles of ethics and basically security, non-discriminatory treatment. And basically, open banking is sharing of client data information in order to create competition in financial products. Now, interestingly, what the central bank has done is starting now, and you'll see the dates, the banks have to first share to the public at large what are the channels they offer and what are the products and the service they offer. I'm not talking about the client itself, but the products themselves. Then, in the near future, banks will be obliged to share information about the client. So any information that you have about the client, plus any information you have obtained from the client in public records and public searches and data systems, that have to be shared with other banks and other financial institutions upon approval of the client. Also, each of the banks and payment institutions that offer products will have to share individually information about the client checking account, saving account, prepaid, postpaid, credit, salaries account, foreign exchange transaction, accreditation, acquiring service, any kind of investment, insurance, and pension funds. So just for you to have an idea of an example here, it would be, I have a bank account in bank A, and I have a bank account with another financiera, which is a company that lends money. And the financiera says, do you go on your overdraft account a lot? And in bank A, and the answer is yes. So would you like me to offer a cheaper credit line so you don't have to pay expensive overdraft account interest rates? Yeah, sure. So upon my consent, this second financial institution will be able to access information, transaction information, and person information in my account in bank A, so that it will be monitored when I'm about to go under and go for the overdraft account, and simply they will offer 1 day before that a new credit line cheaper, so I don't use the bank A overdraft facility. As you can see, it will create a lot of competition into the system. Now, in addition to that, there are two other, so just to understand, these are information about products, right? And client information about their credit analysis. And there's also service. There's one new service that is being created, which is the payment initiator, which is something that probably WhatsApp will fall under, which is an entity that provides instruction to make a payment, but they don't touch the money. So basically, this entity, upon approval on request of a client, will simply go into someone's account and order transfer of money for any kind of payment in Brazil. So this ends with the automatic debit structure we have in Brazil. And also they're creating, as well as a service, a kind of a marketplace for credit. So someone that wants to take credit will be able to put its information on a marketplace, and banks will be able to bid to see who gets the cheaper interest rates for that specific individual that wants a loan. And finally, here is just a general information on who has to enter the open banking in Brazil. So S1 and S2 financial institutions, which means the larger systemic banks and also medium to large banks will be obliged to enter the data sharing. So all the products, all the credit information, they're obliged. However, other financial institutions are not required to do so. However, if I have an S3 bank or an S3, S4 financial institution that is willing to offer products and want to share the information with other financial institutions, in other words, wants to get information from an S1, as soon as they enter the open banking, they also themselves have to give the information and enter the market. So S1, S2 compulsory, others not compulsory. Once you do it, once you enter as a non-compulsory, you become part of the open banking and you have to share your information as well. The payment initiator will be regulated. The central bank just issued a new set of rules whereby which companies need to be part of it. And again, the credit proposal is something that still needs to be created. Finally, open banking is only for regulated banks and payment institutions, depending on the products. It's not open for non-financial entities. It is possible for a non-financial entity to partner up with a financial entity. However, it will only be able to access the information in that financial entity. That does not mean that this entity, this non-regulated entity, will have unlimited access to other information obtained through open banking. Only in this bilateral regulation. Central bank was very concerned to not opening up too much open banking because it contains a lot of private information that is protected by bank secrecy. Therefore, open banking is only for regulated entities, not for non-regulated. Finally, it's important to mention as well that the way the central bank is looking into how it can charge. So for you to understand this drawing, you have the client in the middle. You have a bank with my information, the donor, the account holder that provides the information. And you have the other bank, which is also have a relationship, but is the entity that asks for the information. So in my example, the entity that wants to access how many times or how is my balance in my bank account so that it can offer me a loan cheaper than the overdraft account. So what the rule says that the relationship between the donor bank and the client, you cannot charge for any fees for data sharing. For the relationship between the receiving bank and the client, also again, you cannot charge any fees for the open bank itself. The only thing you can do is we're able to charge for aggregating information. But the critical point is here. So basically, between this relationship, you can charge some fees, but these are very limited for situations. So if you do at least 2 interface calls between the receiving bank and the donor bank regarding the client's personal information like data information, not transaction information, you can do it twice a month per client without any fees. And regarding transaction information, you can do up to 120 calls for the donor. So you can 120 times access the information at the donor bank without any fees and without any charges. Above that, then you'll be able to collect the fees. And how much you can collect, how much a donor can charge, well, this will be subject to a convention. So the convention is where the participants of the open banking will have to agree on technical standards, standardization layouts, demand for referrals, reimbursements, fees, and things like that. Obviously, it's a very tense environment because you have the small players and the big players with the same ability to vote on different issues. Central bank will be looking into that and will be basically interfering when there is a tight situation or the system is stuck in one of the matters. So the logic is quite interesting logic. Let's see if it's working. Finally, this is the timeline for open banking in Brazil, and is extremely aggressive. So the light blue schedule has to do with the implementation of the open banking, and the dark blue has to do with the convention. So the convention is where the obligations of the parties, they have to comply. So I'm not going to go over, but as you can see, it's pretty tight of things that the banks, the participants have to agree. But the most interesting thing is here on the light blue, which is basically all the sharing of information and the channels. We start already on the 30th of November. They need to comply already, have already agreed on how you're going to access the general channels and how they access the products. And then on the 31st of May, you need already to share client information, transaction information regarding accounts and credit, and then you go to 2021 until the end of the year. So basically, if you put these two together, it's a very aggressive timeline involving too many parties discussing technical issues and governance issues. So people are saying it's going to be tough, but the central bank keeps pushing for this to happen. So that's it, guys. Sorry for going a little bit over the time, but that's basically what we have. Let me just stop sharing the video here.
No worries, Bruno. It was really good presentation, really deep, really interesting. We're going to start with the Q&A with Marco. Marco, can you take over?
Yes, of course. Bruno, excellent presentation. Thank you very much for this. I have two questions on my side here. I understand that you participated in the process of the implementation or the trying of the implementation of WhatsApp Pay in Brazil. So my question is very straightforward. What are the next steps? Like from a regulation standpoint, what should we expect in terms of next steps from central bank?
Sure.
And then I'll go over to my second question.
Sure. So remember that, as I mentioned, and again, it's all public information. So if you, what I'm sharing with you guys is not privileged information. But as I mentioned, WhatsApp did not create a payment arrangement itself. WhatsApp is just a technology part that connects to existing payment arrangements. So basically, there's something called tokenization. So basically, you get your debit card data and you tokenize it under MasterCard and Visa rules. That information is not accessible by WhatsApp. It's basically a tokenization and cryptographic work on the information on the payment system itself. And what happens is that I simply, if I have my WhatsApp, I say I want to pay you, Marco, and I'll simply send you a message and press pay. And what happens is then obviously the Visa or MasterCard rating come into force. So what the central bank looked into that, and they said, okay, but are you creating a new payment arrangement? And the answer was no. However, note that there is two ways to use WhatsApp Pay in Brazil under the current model. One is the P2P model, so I transfer money from one individual to another. The other is I pay something, so it's a P2M. On the P2M, honestly, the central bank asks for information, but there's nothing new in the system. It's what we call card not present acquisition. When you go online and you buy something, use exactly the same method. The difference is that you're just using WhatsApp on both sides, but the payment itself, so there's no creation of a system. On the P2P model, the central bank understood that this was a specific transfer arrangement. So in Brazil, you have different arrangements, purchase arrangement, and you can have a purchase domestic arrangement, a purchase international arrangement, and you can have a transfer arrangement. And in the past, the central bank had the understanding that if you transfer money between two individuals, but there is a chance that there is a sale of a good or a service, then this should be considered as part of a purchase arrangement. So for example, if I transfer money to my personal trainer, the personal trainer has provided a service, and therefore there is a commercial transaction. So at the time, 4 years ago, the central bank was still learning, and they told the networks that, oh, because there is always a chance of a transaction behind individuals, this should be classified as a purchase arrangement. So if you look into Visa and MasterCard rules today, the typical product that WhatsApp uses, which is called MasterCard Send in MasterCard, for example, it is already contained in the purchase arrangement. So there was nothing new. Central bank look into that and say, we change our mind. We want you networks to create another payment arrangement, which is called a transfer payment. So what happens in the last days is the networks created new rules for transfer arrangements and have submitted to the central bank. So now what we're doing is waiting to see what the central bank will look into this payment arrangement, the new payment arrangements, approve them or make comments. And in theory, it should allow the system to go back. So that's the expectation of the market, because we don't see anything different here in the market. There is no discrimination. It is an already existing system. And the only reason that they are waiting for central bank approval is because the central bank did change the rule a couple of weeks ago to say that although there is, as I explained, a minimum threshold, once you hit the thresholds, you get the approval, the central bank now can ask a product to stop or to be suspended if it believes there will be a chance of causing lack of equilibrium in the system. So they created this rule to stop WhatsApp, to analyze the system. And so we're waiting now for the answer from the central bank.
Sure, very clear. And another question on my side, we have been watching some of the acquiring companies launching cards, and they're basically prepaid cards where the company has no delinquency risk at all, but they charge an interchange fee very close to the credit card. Do you see or do you foresee a change in regulation on this, or eventually the central bank looking at this, high interchange fee on the prepaid card and say, look, from now on, we're going to charge the debit interchange, which is roughly 1/3 of the interchange fee from credit cards? Thank you.
Right. I think the central bank, this administration central bank, has shown that they have a little bit of a more an interfering mode than other previous chairmen and officers of the central bank. But I think what they decided to do is not to interfere anymore in the market, but simply create competition through PIX. So at the end of the day, if you have a cheaper system that people will prefer, then obviously the prepaid cards which charge a high interchange fee will probably lose market and they'll have to adapt themselves. So I think the central bank is counting, and that's another reason why hasn't the central bank changed the settlement of credit cards, and why hasn't the central bank stopped the installment payment in Brazil, which are kind of very Brazilian unique features. I think at the end of the day is trying to tweak a market that has reached its own equilibrium. You can agree that is not fair or fair. The point is that it has achieved a specific equilibrium based on market forces. It is very difficult to understand the consequences. So I think the central bank decided to, let's push for open banking, let's push for the credit fintech, let's push for PIX, and let's see in a couple of months or years to see how the market has now landed and if it's necessary to again artificially interfere in the market.
Bruno, great presentation, great content. Thanks for sharing with us this morning. One of the discussions we had in the past, you mentioned that you were the legal advisor for some of the fintech unicorns in Brazil at the early days, when you helped them to develop the business models, develop the products and the services. And since that time, I think a lot has changed. I think the market has developed a lot. And my question would be more, how do you see these new regulatory changes? Do you see them open space for new companies? Or do you see them actually consolidating the growth of the existing, more mature fintechs? And the second one is, how do you see the traditional banks or the traditional financial institutions acquiring fintechs? How do you see the central bank will look at this, given they are pushing for more competition, changing laws and the regulatory framework? Thank you.
Sure. So let me start with the second one. I think one thing that changed at the central bank, and you see about recent changes regarding entering or joint venture agreements by larger banks, or the XP Itaú case, is where the central bank decided to become much more harsh on acquisition by larger banks. I think the logic is we always created a system to create a strong big players, and therefore the central bank was always willing and allowing M&A involving the large banks with mid-sized banks or large banks with fintechs. The point is that I think the central bank has changed, and I see a lot of difficulty for large banks and even mid-sized banks to acquire fintechs. And the reason is the central bank wants to push more diversification. And therefore, what we discuss with the central bank is that, look, don't even come Itaú or Bradesco with acquiring that company, because probably we're not going to pass, because we believe your economic power is still so big that it may distort the market. So we will not allow consolidation in the market. So I see a lot of difficulty for larger players to buy fintechs. Obviously, an acquisition for technology purposes is a little bit different, but still, I think it's a lot of trouble for the larger incumbent banks. On the fintech side, I think clearly there is a willing of the central bank to hear these companies more. So you see very common, they meet with these companies much more often, they hear their demands, they even see new models. They created now the lab lift at the central bank to see ideas. They have the sandbox. And honestly, I've seen situations whereby the fintech rules, for example, we created some models, and then I thought it would be interesting to show the central bank, because although legally there was no lending by a non-authorizing entity, the economics were basically allowed a possible interpretation. And the interesting thing is that when I showed the model to the central bank, you had about like 20, 30 people at the central bank look into that and asking to follow the model. So that's the first time you're saying, wow, the regulator is following a non-regulating model. Interesting. And so then the central bank came to this company and say, why don't we create a specific rule for you guys that works? And in fact, they created the credit fintech companies. So I think this is to say that I don't think the central bank is treating the larger banks badly. It simply is looking into alternative models with the goal of bringing more competition. And therefore, they are more flexible into creating rules and adapting rules. And for example, we have a VC client that wanted to become the controlling shareholder of a fintech bank. And in Brazil, controlling shareholders of an institution cannot be VCs because you don't identify who's the controlling shareholder. However, they create an exception and allowed VCs to control fintech banks, which is something never heard in Brazil. And the logic is we want to bring more competition. And clearly a VC has the capacity to invest and compete with the larger banks. So as you see, they are in a way changing a lot the way the central bank used to think from the last 5 years.
I guess a last question on my end, Bruno. So the presentation was super clear. And when we look at it, what called my attention is that the timeline is in fact really tight, right? So if you look at PSD1 and PSD2 in England, they also had, like on paper, it was a really, really, really good plan, right? With clear deadlines. But when the deadline reached, the banks weren't able to comply, and open banking now is starting to evolve, but didn't really involve the time that they thought it was going to happen. So my question to you is, how do you envision this scenario in Brazil? And from a technological standpoint, from what you know and what you're seeing and the advising of the firms, are the banks and the fintechs, I think yes, but like ready with their APIs to comply with open banking? How do you think it's going to be the next steps?
Yeah, Julia, I actually discussed this with the central bank. We did a webinar with the two regulators at the central bank to discuss open banking. And I kind of bluntly asked them and say, don't you think this timeline is too aggressive? Can you imagine a Bradesco or Itaú or Banco do Brasil, the systems changes and the requirements? And the answer is that yes, we believe so. Yes, it's a tight. However, it's very difficult for us as central bank to hear the complaints and saying, this is impossible to meet because there is a vested interest by the larger banks that do not want open banking. And so how much is realistically a system issue and how much is game to hold open banking and gain time? So because of that, honestly, we are listening to other players in the market and we believe it is feasible. So they kind of, there is a little bit of discredit of the central bank towards the larger banks when they claim operational difficulties and system difficulties because they hear the fintech companies. Now, situations, and interestingly, what I saw was quite impressive is if you look at England, for example, they created the standard APIs with a very high security structure. And the problem with that, it was too expensive for the small fintech companies to adhere to these security standards. And as a result, the open banking stayed only with the larger banks. The central bank heard that, and then what happened, it went to the Association of Mid-Sized Banks and went to the ABCD, which is the FinTech Association, say, guys, can you create a API standard that is safe and cheap so that you guys can meet? And they did a POC, and they created something that is in theory cheaper and easier to implement. And so what they're trying to do is to show, look, we can do something cheaper and you guys, larger banks, can follow this cheaper standard because it's as good as. So there's a lot of discussions there. And again, the central bank says, it's very difficult for me to say how much is realistically a claim of system and how much is the game whereby let's push it as much as we can because I don't have any interest in open banking.
Super clear. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the presentation. I would like to thank Bruno. It was super, super interesting and super deep. Thank you for your time. And thank you, Brunetti and Marco, for participating as well.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you. Bye-bye.